In our thoracic and abdominal cavities, the pelvic cavity, when inhaling, the pressure inside our abdominal cavity is positive, and the pressure inside the pelvic cavity is positive, while the pressure inside the thoracic cavity is negative. Then when we inhale, as the diaphragm moves downward, the pressure inside the thoracic cavity becomes even lower, so the atmospheric pressure outside pushes air into the lungs. This completes one inhalation, so how can we inhale even more? Let me tell you, when my diaphragm moves to this point, it only increases the vertical dimension of the lungs, right? As my diaphragm descends, it only increases the vertical dimension of the lungs, correct? If I descend to a certain extent and encounter abdominal pressure, at this point the middle part stops moving and the sides begin to contract, which then opens up the ribs. At this moment, the horizontal dimension of the lungs increases, allowing more air to be inhaled. Additionally, when inhaling, the sternum opens forward and your thoracic spine extends, so at this point the anterior-posterior dimension of the lungs also increases. When the dimensions of the lungs in all directions, front, back, left, right, up and down, expand, you can inhale more air. This is the principle of inhalation. As for exhalation, it's like this. Once the lungs are open, they have their own elasticity, which allows them to contract and expel some air due to their elastic recoil. However, if your pelvic floor muscles and abdominal muscles do not exert force in this way, it is impossible to completely empty the air from the lungs. However, relying on the elastic recoil of the lungs is sufficient to meet your oxygen needs when you are at rest. That is to say, when you are lying still, or sitting still, or just using a computer, your breathing is adequate. But if you are running or lifting weights, then relying solely on the elastic recoil of the lungs won't expel enough air. If you can't expel it, doesn't it just occupy space in the lungs? If it occupies space, then fresh oxygen cannot enter. So at this point, the frequency of your breathing can only increase. Therefore, during exercise, you actually need the involvement of your pelvic floor muscles and abdominal muscles to expel more air from the lungs. This is the principle of inhalation and exhalation. However, I need to explain here that if your diaphragm does not descend, you cannot inhale air. Your diaphragm must descend for you to be able to inhale air, and this is why you can exhale without the involvement of any muscles. However, if your diaphragm and auxiliary inhalation muscles do not participate, you cannot inhale air. You can understand it as inhalation must rely on muscles, while exhalation can rely on the lungs' own elasticity without muscles. However, during physical activity, exhalation requires muscle involvement. When you are naturally at rest and not moving, in a state where your oxygen consumption is relatively low, you can exhale without muscle involvement. This is the difference between them. And how low is the range at the base level? The extent to which it opens the ribs determines how much air can be filled into your lungs. Under normal circumstances, if we simply talk about the number of muscle fibers, isn't the right side more than the left side? Do you remember the diaphragm? The right side is larger than the left side, remember? If we look purely at its form, isn't the right side stronger, right? The right side is stronger. So if we are only talking about the form of the diaphragm and the number of muscle fibers, the right diaphragm is naturally stronger than the left when inhaling. No problem there. This also means that if it has more muscle fibers, it also means that the right diaphragm should normally sink lower than the left, right? However, because the liver is on the right and the stomach is on the left, as it sinks down, it encounters the liver and can't sink further. The stomach on the left is smaller unless you are full. Your stomach is small, it only weighs about 6 ounces, so at this time your left side can sink a bit lower.